Jim Miller, welcome to the Unicorn Podcast.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Very excited to have this conversation. You have one of the most front and center recruiting roles in the TA industry today. And this podcast is about helping the folks that listen get to the place that, our guests are at today. So I'm very interested to know what got you to where you are today and what you advise for others as they navigate their career path, particularly in the changing environment. Yeah, how do they navigate the AI things, the different processes that have kind of come to the forefront as a result of AI and advanced technologies. But our whole philosophy at Unicorn is that there's no school for recruiting. There's no master's degree in TA. So we rely on the community of people who have achieved to kind of share that experience with us to do it. And I personally got to where I was in TA by finding someone great and standing next to them and learning from what they've done. And the differences that have made me what I'm doing today are the ways that I've iterated. So will everyone follow exactly what you do? No. Will they agree with it? Maybe not, maybe. But you're giving them this framework so that they're starting from somewhere that's not the pure finish line. How do they get past those first mistakes? But I know your background very well. For those who are just joining or meeting you for the first time here, who is Jim Miller? How'd you get to where you are today? And kind of what brought you to Ashby as your current role?
Thank you. So I'm Jim. I'm the head of people and talent at Ashby. We're an ATS. We make people tech technology. We make people technology. A SaaS business. Been in business for about 7 years, and I joined the company at 60 employees. Going back in time, I've been in TA almost 25 years. It'll be 25 years next May. And I did 5 years in agency, first of all, Aerotech, Allegis, Tech Systems, that company in the London office, hiring software engineers into media companies and banks in the UK. And then I joined Google. I was the first individual contributor technical recruiter for the Google London Dev Center. It had only just opened. There was only one engineer had been hired when I joined. So I got to build out all of that. And then I worked my way through the ranks. I started off as an 11th at Google and ended up 15 years later as the global head of online talent channels. So running the entire inbound function for Google. I left in 2021 to be geographically closer to my wife's family to support our growing family. And full story with a company that took the leap on me and said, hey, come work for us. So I joined them as the head of TA. And partway through that journey, I put Ashby in. And loved the product so much, I pitched myself for a role that didn't exist, and here I am 2.5 years later.
Incredible. I have to ask this question because so very similar story in that, I started in agency recruiting and then went in-house at some companies. But then when I came to California to work at a tech startup, and I worked at Uber, who hired me out of the Los Angeles office, which was at the time an 8-person office. I was like the 400th person at Uber. But I always think to myself, like, would I have gotten the job with my experience if I would try to be that in San Francisco? You know what I mean? Like, would I, if it wasn't right place, right time for me, which I think is a discounted part of, these meteoric rises in TA, is like, sometimes you have to catch there's a huge benefit to being in San Francisco or the epicenters of wherever your tech community is. But for me personally, I don't think I would have gotten in if I started in San Francisco. I'm happy that I was in Los Angeles and was able to kind of satellite into this amazing brand because I might have been, a bigger fish in a smaller pond. What are your thoughts on Google? Would you have made it if you came to San Francisco? What do you think?
I don't know. I resisted it for a decade and finally said, okay, I'd come over for a particular role in 2015. I'm an experimenter. I like to drive change. I like to disrupt. And I had the Atlantic to defend me. So I was able to do a lot of things and to do a lot of things very, very differently, which got me noticed. And that's what, there were taps on the shoulders and things like that. And because of what I was doing, if I'd have been in the US, I probably would have had to conform to existing processes, whereas I was able to build from scratch, greenfield development. And actually a lot of what I built in EMEA then got transferred over to the US to become best practice. So that disruption was the big thing for me. So the likelihood is no. However, you can tell by the shirt, I get noticed anyway.
I'm jealous of the show. I have to come out of my whatever podcast uniform that I'm doing. What do you think when folks are trying to make the transition into these larger tech companies, like the interview process is a big part of it, especially coming from agency. Like agency has such a different reward system and metric set, which for better or for worse, from the on the some carry over into the corporate world. But when you're interviewing at a company like Google, how did you prepare for it? What do you think was the thing that got you into such an established tech business, albeit a greenfield development role in the UK?
Well, first of all, the thing that went horribly wrong in my interviews was data. So the regional director, Randy Knaflick, who has gone on to have a meteoric career himself as the head of people at Jawbone and SpaceX, he asked me about pass-through rate data and this kind of information, typical kind of in-house data. And it was just not a metric that I'd ever been concerned with. At Allegis Group, we put one candidate forward per job. So there's no concept of pass-through rate because you've got a whole bunch of recruiters all fighting to get their candidate put forward for that one interview opening. So that was quite alien to me. So I had to kind of think on my feet and talk around the subject and talk about what I actually did and why it wasn't a pertinent data set. So I hadn't really been exposed to it. The thing that went right was I was lucky enough to be interviewed by Google's first recruiter, who happened to be on a stopover in London that week. So I get in a room and I said, look, it says on your resume that you've been training recruiters. I was leading the training function for Allegis in Europe, as well as a couple of other different jobs I was doing. I said, yeah. She's like, what do you train? So, well, for example, Boolean logic. She's like, you train new recruiters on Boolean. How do you do that? And I said, through the medium of toys of the 90s. And she was like, what? So it's like, there's a whiteboard I can show you. So I walked through my Boolean logic training on toys of the 90s because I was a great believer that if you start sticking Java and C++ and Python into the brackets, all of a sudden you've just lost your audience. But if the concept is something that they can anchor on, and bearing in mind, this was nearly 20 years ago next month, the 1980s were much closer than they are today. It kind of really resonated and people could understand the logic rather than worrying about the content. So I sat and went through this. And the common theme about what I'll talk about today about people and growing their careers is about becoming a teacher, teaching the skills that you have, the expertise that you've built. And you don't have to be the most senior person, have the biggest paycheck in the room to teach people. It's leading without authority that gets you through. And that was an opportunity to teach and to showcase something. And it showed that I understood my topic, but it also showed that I could communicate to my future peers and help elevate everybody. And that's the value that they saw. And that overcame my failure on the data interview.
I love that. I love that. For those interested, we have an article on Unicorn called The Science of the Recruiting Funnel. I'd off record or even on record, love to hear your thoughts on it. But it essentially looks at the stages of funnel pass-through rates and generally gives some initial targets. But what it does is it diagnoses kind of like what the underlying pass-through rates mean and how to get them closer to a benchmark through the partnerships that you take. So for anyone interested in the pass-through rate data, especially if you're interviewing from agency for your first corporate role, it is a basic understanding of the funnel. While it can be overcome and you can land jobs at places like Google, the more competitive the labor market gets, the more interesting that data becomes as a prep topic for it.
I have a passionate hatred of pass-through rates, by the way.
Yeah, I think
I don't believe they're fit for purpose. And I believe it's all because it's highly restricted by the headcount that's available rather than the work that you do, so that they can be very, very misleading.
I actually just did a podcast with Chris Mannion. He's another provider in the headcount space, and we were talking about different limitations in capacity. So obviously there's recruiting capacity as a function of total roles. There's also recruiting capacity as a function of like the workload that you're doing. But there's also this product we want to develop where it's a calculation of interview hour availability from the hiring manager. And this was a big blocker at Uber. People would want, they'd come and say, I need 10 people. And I would just look at the people who would hire those 10 people. Like, you don't have enough hours in the day to meet the targets of what it is that you're asking for. If you did you have a city to run, you have drivers and riders to combine, right? But even if you forgot all that and just interviewed, you still wouldn't have the amount of time. And so the capacity limitations or your understanding of capacity limitations, I think plays into what you just said was another key fact of you getting into Google, which is your ability to communicate up. one of my biggest mentors, like the first person who gave me my shot, Grace Migliaccio, if you're listening, she gave me my first manager role at this company called Travel Click. And I would like, we were underwater all the time. I would grind, 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 and we would just never have enough. And she said, a good carpenter cleans up at the end, right? So it's better if you do 9 out of 10 and spend that last one communicating upwards and articulating why things are happening and how you need to get around them, what the impact is, and then using that communication to unlock for yourself future resources. So you're not the duck spinning the legs underneath than it is for you to do that 10th thing. And yeah, you might be closer to the goal, but you've done no better in educating the folks who are asking something of this service of recruiting. And so I think as I look at your rise, so for anyone who's not following Jim Miller on LinkedIn, go follow him. He's great content, good podcast, obviously, great taste. But looking at the trajectory at Google, you don't get from, first person in London at an individual contributor level to your role, to your exit trajectory without being able to manage up. So I'm curious to know, like, what do you do in that? Or what do you recommend that people do when it comes to managing up? What do you think is the best practice, the way to do things like that?
Every best practice starts with foundations. And the first thing I did when I joined was rip the ATS apart. I wanted to understand how it worked. It had been built by an engineer who was long gone. It was 6 years old when I joined Google. There was zero documentation. No one knew how to use it. I was immediately told you can't find candidates in it. And I don't believe anything that I'm told. So I went and ripped this thing apart. And then 4 weeks later, I get a tap on the shoulder going, you figured out how to use the ATS. Can you train everybody else that's coming in? I pulled apart the processes. Why do we do it this way? Is there a different way of doing things? I looked at all of the data. There was a phrase at Google in the early days. Engineer with a clipboard with data is far more powerful than a VP without one. So I learned the underlying data behind everything before I started to try and influence and to drive change. And that's the key element. The second key element about influencing up is to be seen as a thought leader without title. So that's that leadership without authority piece. Are you bringing everybody else on a journey with you? Are you teaching the other people in your teams, the wider organization, what it is that's making you successful? Are you sharing your Legos? Because if you are, then they want to listen to you and understand because you're a key component of their organization, because you are lifting the bottom to the top continuously, that kind of continuous improvement philosophy. And that gets you noticed. And that was what got me my first tap on the shoulder for a leadership role as well.
That's a good insight, I think. So I do a lot of early stage involvement with like aspiring TA folks. I think let's call it a theme. I don't want to speak for it. It's not a permeating theme, but I think there's there's certain defense of being taken advantage of for going outside of your scope, right? So for these folks that are coming up in their career who are good at something or, do the ATS, tear apart into a training, how do they ensure that gets recognized and that they can convert that effort, that extra, that above and beyond into some level of promotion or recognition? Like, how do they internally advertise without coming off as, you know, cocky or overly confident? I think there's a perception amongst the younger generation that there's this corporate culture of taking advantage. Like, if you do the best work, you get the most work, and not that you're rewarded for it. So what do you advise TA folks who, like, okay, I'm producing my hires, I'm running my funnel, my candidates have a good experience, my hiring managers are happy, I do great reporting, but now I have to do this above and beyond thing. How do I get noticed for that above and beyond thing? And how do I make sure that that's the focus of the business and that my work is being recognized?
I start off with do the right thing. If it's the right thing, it will get noticed. If it's the wrong thing, then you've got a judgment issue and you needed that feedback anyway. My second piece is that curiosity trumps marketing all the time. So if you've pulled apart the ATS and it's not doing what it's supposed to do, go ask the question, why does it do this? You'll eventually get bumped to somebody who understands this and says, yeah, that's a bug. All of those people on that journey will recognize that you've pulled out something of value because you've done the right thing. At no stage are you saying, hey, look at me, I did something. There's a massive difference between those two pieces, and it's all anchored in doing the right thing in the first place. The other element of what you're talking about there is the reward for doing great work is more work. I disagree. time is our one finite resource. So doing the right thing often means saving time, not just for you, but for a whole bunch of people. One of the folks from back in those days in Google, in the first day, they got thrown in a room with me, and I drew this chart on a whiteboard. It was a very long-winded flow diagram, which basically meant here is how you operationalize what you do without having to remember to do anything. Because all the stress and anxiety in life comes from forgetting to do something. Whereas if you've got automation built in, and this is 2006, into your workflows. So you've got calendar pop up and says, right, you've got to go and do this thing. You've got an email that you're then waiting on the response from another human. All of these different elements all mean that you have none of that anxiety and you save time. Productivity per resource went up through the roof for that first piece because no candidate got left behind. That was the right thing to do for the candidate, and it saved people time. There was no extra work as a reward for that. We all actually got to be that much more focused, and they needed fewer recruiters, and we all had a better life because we weren't doing noisy, busy work.
It's interesting that you say that. So I have this, it's not necessarily correlated to the recruiting process, but we have this interview prep template on Unicorn. And what it does is it takes your resume, it takes the different bullet points, and then it has this, what are the common questions that are being asked? And what is your story? How do you summarize these things quickly? What value did you add? And the idea is that in an interview, you only have so much on the fly thinking. You can only, make magic a percentage of the time. So if you're using it to answer your questions that are the basics, you're using that on the fly thinking up, and you're not going to present when it's actually time to use it in the best possible way. And so by making a flow chart or a diagram or an automation around the things that you do from a recruiting process, I can absolutely see that concept going into like, oh, now I have that, I can be fancy in a negotiation. I can navigate that tough hiring manager. Oh, that new headcount popped up. I have to do prioritization. This is, I can now use my pizzazz instead of wasting it on these everyday tasks. And, I would say a very common topic, I think we're in the middle of it right now, but I'm curious to know the things that made you great from beginning of Google to end, or even through full story into Ashby. There are things that you did. Boolean searches, one of them, right? Those things, are they going away? What things do you think are going away that made you successful? And by going away, that could mean replaced by something else. But like, no one's going to listen to this podcast and then go get expertise in Boolean search because we have all these other tools that are now like automating the sourcing process. But what are the underlying concepts? What do you think is not relevant today? What do you think is relevant today? And how do people kind of like take the lessons about what you've done and apply it using today's technology or the things that are available to them today?
I'll just touch on the Boolean piece. Yes, you might not be writing the Boolean scripts, but the logic behind it is still incredibly valuable when you're doing prompt work, when you're doing any kind of sourcing, and for the most part, when you're building reports. It's still a fundamental skill that if you can grasp it and apply it, it will stand you in good stead. So why not go and learn it? The folks that have got the capability to do that work have done very well for me, even in this modern age within my organizations here at Ashby. For me, the biggest focal point of my career has been quality over quantity. Only letting the very best candidates into the process and the removal of noise. Again, there's a time element to it, but focusing on what truly does great look like for this role, for this department, for this team, for this company, applying that at any level, that's the key differentiator. If you look at us as a company, we've 4x'd Ashby in the 2.5 years since I've been here. And our revenue is multiples of that 4xing over that time period.
Right.
Whereas most companies think about running headcount in linear form with revenue growth, ours has done this, which is all about quality. It's about talent density and any other of these buzzwords. But what it boils down to is hiring the very best person you can for the open role. That's been the focus of my entire 25 years, and everything else plays out from that.
So when I was in high school, I don't know if this analogy is going to land at all, by the way, but I used to build old cars. And one of the biggest things is the paint job, the way that it finishes is 99% the prep work. It has nothing to do with the quality of paint. It has nothing to do with the painting process, nothing. It's all, did you make it look good before you even went in to start the process? And in the world where, we've always encouraged people, I think it's going to be interesting in the age of AI as shortcuts become readily available. I think for the listeners here that are like aspirational to reach leadership, the best mathematicians know how to do it without the calculator. And so, we push this concept on Unicorn called the intake session, where we believe candidates take jobs for two reasons, right? It's better for me today. I like my manager. I like this company, whatever. And it's better for my future. I think that if I'm at this company, I will achieve my future goal faster than if I take a different path. And that is threaded through the intake session document, where what we're trying to extract from the manager is not only alignment to the comp and leveling framework and to the job responsibilities of what the role asks for. We have the section called meets expectations, exceeds expectations. So during the interview process, we can identify the difference between somebody who can do the job and someone who can excel at the job, which is process wise. I think what we offer to our community is like, this is how we're doing the prep work. I'm curious to know how do you identify that best in class, that exceeds expectations, that high density, high quality hire, if I'm using, today's terms of, let's call it hiring ROI, but how do you identify that through the interview process? And how do you train and teach your recruiters to identify those things as they come up underneath you at Ashby?
First of all, I don't trust the hiring managers know what great looks like. So the whole intake meeting thing, there's a whole step that lives before that, right? There's the justification of the headcount from the hiring manager. There is a business case. The business case itself translates into the critical skills, knowledge, ability, attributes, whatever it happens to be, of the individual, because you're talking about what success looks like after 6 months, a year in that role. That's the key piece of information that pulls across. Then there's research. I do a talent map. I've been doing it for 20 years. It was a spreadsheet. Thankfully, AI has come along now, and you can use tools to draw out this information about all of the people that have been hired into this role. But I want to know everything from their education backgrounds to their skills, to the companies that they came from, to the career trajectories they've had, to which job the referrer did, every single thing, so I can pattern match the positives and the negatives. So I can really distill down into what great truly looks like. And then it's about inspiration. I want to create a set of curated talent for a role before the hiring manager has even put pen to paper on the job description, so they can look at these backgrounds and experiences and be inspired by them from a whole range of different backgrounds. Only then do we get towards the job description, and the job description should reflect the criteria that gives the return on investment of this hire downstream. And you cannot, to this 25 years, I've realized in one thing in recruiting, we cannot judge who is great based on paper, right? If we could, then first of all, we'd have turned it into some kind of AI, but that's not compliance because we know all about the biases and everything else. So when it comes down to it, the only way to solve the problem is actually to create choice. And that's what the vast majority of recruiting teams don't do. They hire the first person that gets through the process and past the post. They don't create choice. Bring your hiring manager in early, to use an executive search term, to create a shortlist in partnership with you of the talent from all the different channels, anyone with the aspirational goal of working for your company. And then that group moves through the process together so that you get multiple candidates at the end of the process who are above the bar to give a very difficult decision to the hiring manager and the leadership team for that function. You've got to make their job incredibly tough. That's how you get the very best person for the role. Not on paper, it's this person and stack ranking and then flowing everyone through. Time comes in, everything gets elongated. Your best candidate statistically possibly didn't even get reviewed because you only reviewed the first 10% of the applicant pool, etc.
Yeah, I have two things popped into my head. The first is stark difference from the agency days where you submit one candidate. So for those who are interested in the thought process between external recruiting, which is a great entryway, by the way, into internal recruiting. Myself, you, others who have ascended have all came through that kind of initial training, that the trenches. So anyway, stark difference there. The second thing I found interesting as I watched, just as an external, your hiring process as an outsider, as a practitioner myself, and I have mixed feelings. I'll tell you what they are. You run a process that has a application end date, and the all the good feelings are is like, I understand now after you create this excellence framework of getting to choice and making it extremely hard. The other side of that coin is a lot of the aspiring, Ashby's brand is phenomenal, right? As is Google's, as is Uber's. These companies that we've worked for, I think, are the end state of what inbound recruiting looks like. However, for our aspiring TA leaders who might not be in, they're in a upstart, they're in an industry that doesn't have the same level of inbound recognition, or with this idea that I'm still getting to the bottom of this. How many what's the incentive for fraud resumes? But they exist. So when you run a process like that, everyone might not have access to run that process, or how do you restart it at the end of that if it doesn't end up in a hire? So curious to know, like, I see that, I'm like, that is ideal state. But then I'm thinking, in practice, how's that really working out? I've always had a curiosity because it's awesome to see from the outside. The response you get on LinkedIn's amazing. So little inside info, like how did you come to that decision? How do you do it?
So first of all, there's a compliance element. So Colorado state law says any non-evergreen rec where the person can work with someone in Colorado or can work in Colorado, which is true for us because we're a fully remote company, has to have an expiration date on their job descriptions. So it's compliance from the get-go. We use data to inform us of how long do we need that job description open for if we've had that role open historically, how many days. That informs in advance. There is nothing that says you cannot extend that end date if you haven't seen the response you're expecting. So you can iterate on it at all times. Then at any time during the process, we're using the predictive analytics in Ashby to tell us whether or not we've dropped below 2 hires predicted from the pass-through rates. This is where the pass-through rates thing comes in. There's only one headcount, but it's predicting me 2 hires because I'm creating choice. Ideally, I want to be around 3 or 4 hires predicted. And then, of course, I've got a problem downstream from that because I only made 1 hire and now my pass-through rates are messed up. So a whole different conversation. You've got multiple checkpoints all the way through. We don't start resume review until after the application closing date. Then we use an objective process to take that resume review, first of all, through the people who don't qualify for the role. Then we do a long listing and then shortlisting. And the hiring manager gets to select from the shortlist who gets into the interview process. And they have an end count they're allowed. So if we predict we could get 3 hireable candidates from 21 people in that first step, it'll be 21. So they've got to go from maybe 30 down to 21 on paper with the application questions as well to inform them who are the 21 people who are going to get time on the calendar. Saving time on the calendar is the thing that shrinks time to fill and time in process for us. And actually, we're faster now than we were before we had this process in place, even though we go slow at the beginning. Volumes are key. We mitigate the volumes by having a very robust application form. And that application form has multiple types of question in it. Some questions are nested. Some questions are ambiguous. Some questions involve clicking a link and giving an opinion on something. All of them added together means that the fraud systems have a real struggle to actually get past this without standing out or aborting partway through. So when I post in advance of a recruiter role opening and everyone's like, Jim, what are you doing? You're going to get 10,000 applications. I might get 400 or 500, but every single one of those people is a recruiter who's well aligned to that job. I don't
Interesting.
Candidates who aren't matched. I've mitigated the disappointment to the masses up front, and I've also avoided the fraud situation. And now we have fraud signal in Ashby. We launched it last week. So now I can test my assumptions that my application form is doing what I intend it to do.
So I have 3 thoughts coming out of that. The first is, 1, I have to assume that in a time span, like this is where my recruiting brain goes, in the time span that it takes from start to finish, especially with an extended deadline, if you're not reviewing applications until the deadline is passed, then I have to presume that there is a application first interview drop-off rate. You might have a lower conversion rate up there because folks are finding a job, or no, that you don't experience that too much.
Our postings average 5 days. Right?
Okay. So yeah, in that,
because we know when the job is finishing, we schedule the time in our calendars to do the resume review. So resume review is done by the end of the 6th day from posting.
I love that.
Now you
Okay.
tell me how long it takes everybody else to do their resume review from when they first post. What's the lag time from application to resume review?
Right.
Likely longer than 6 days.
Okay. I like that. So, all right, the next thought is you have 3 to 4 people who've made it through the fine to the, these are people who you think the hiring manager could choose either one, they could do the job great. How are you handling brand declines? How do you communicate to these folks that that choice was made after they've invested that much time in the process? Like, what is your style of decline so that you can manage that?
So first of all, you've got the power of redundancy built in there. So if you get a decline at the top end, then candidate number 2 is available immediately for that. So you're mitigating any situations on your business side. Secondly, if you've got a headcount plan and you've got multiples of this role coming up in the future, now you can talk to finance and senior leadership to say whether or not you want to pull the role forward. So we have hired 4 people for a single headcount and pulled 3 headcount forward before because we've loved every single one of the 4 people. So we can talk about that. Secondly, this deep transparency. The process is defined in our job descriptions. There's even why you don't want to apply for this job, the sell out, which is something that I bought from my agency days. We used to sell the candidates out because if you're only putting one person forward, you need their commitment. And you're explaining it again in the very first recruiter call. So everybody understands and is completely free to withdraw from this process. Then there's the understanding that if I do get through this, not only did I get to the end of the process, but I'm not the first person. I am truly the best person. And people want that challenge and they drive themselves for that. You end up with stronger interview performance because you've explained this all the way through. And finally, if you do get to the end and you are disappointed, I want very, very deep, meaningful feedback. Here's the strengths, here are the weaknesses that we saw, here are some quotes that we've pulled out, and we can use our tooling to bring that information to the forefront and to really talk it through with people to add real value to them for their future job search.
Yeah, I like that. You're bringing up something that is, I would say, non-traditional, or it's off the beaten path, which is adding application friction. Like I hear, the one that shall not be named, ATS. If I'm talking to the head of recruiting at Ashby, there's a lot of pushback on the friction in the application process by having to create a login, et cetera. But you're not talking about like operational friction. You're talking about this idea that you want to sell somebody out of the role so that they know when they're in the role. Well, one, you want to eliminate the fraud, and having a signal on top of a process that has this like almost CAPTCHA style interaction with somebody who has to prove that there's an interest and an aptitude. But how do you think those who don't work at a mega brand like Ashby would apply application friction? Would you recommend it to everybody, or is that something that has do you look for an indicator where it's like, all right, now we're ready to go, whether it's application volume or?
Mitigating the disappointment of the masses was the theme behind a lot of this. We saw this huge wave of applications coming through, the empowerment of the workforce to apply for everything over the last few years. So anything that we can do to deflect, to save those people's time is key if they're going to be immediate rejections because they're not qualified for the role. So that's the first intent. It's actually to give the human back the time if they don't fit. The application questions that are designed for the application form for a recruiter role are designed to actually be quite interesting to answer. They're designed to showcase your ability because I believe the application questions can be the great equalizer on the application overall, the whole package. Yes, you've got people who are very good at writing a resume, and you've got people who can buy the services of a resume writer. But we're very clear. We are not going to only screen the first 10%. So take your time over your application and make your best effort. If it comes in at 1 minute to the deadline, it's in, you will be reviewed, and you've got an equal opportunity with everybody else. So I can ask deliberate questions that draw out the experience that someone has to do the job that I need somebody to do. There's nothing that stops any company from doing that and explaining this is what gives you the best chance of being hired, because we will read everything. The people that have told jokes to me in the application form to make sure that I read them and I've responded back to their joke with a LinkedIn message know that if I'm the resume reviewer, and I have been for the majority of our recruiter roles until I put team leads in place, I'm the person responding and I'm reading every single one of those.
Right.
Yes, there's a question in there that says, impress me with the Boolean logic. I don't want you to work for free. This is subject matter of your choice. People realize what he's wanting here is not how do I find a Java engineer? It's can I apply interesting logic here? They'll write me a Boolean that helps me find my a new favorite cheese. This kind of concept, because now I can see how your brain works. That's the reason for the question. And it also says in there, yes, you might call me a dinosaur, but logic's still the underlying piece of everything to do with AI and so on that we're seeing today.
No, I like it. There's a reason why there's a test. The math test doesn't include a calculator. It's not because you don't have access to it. It's the underlying logic. And I think you brought up something that's very in line with the way Unicorn approaches resume. So we do have a template up there for download. So if anyone's looking for a resume that, yeah, I essentially consolidated the format of the resume books we used to get from the top 10 MBA programs at Uber. So similar format, etc. But our concept with the resume is like the resume is the movie poster, the interview is the preview, and the job's the movie, right? So what you want to do is communicate you want to give people the context as to why they're interested to dive deeper into that movie trailer. And so with a resume, it's not just an advertisement with this additional question set. It's kind of like that. You're almost introducing this additional, I'm gonna have to come up with a new analogy, but you're introducing this other kind of soft pitch about like, what do I bring to the table? What am I able to do that kind of enhances the rest, like enhanced applications, so that you can get to this point of, all right, now let's explore the trailer together.
We've been
Super interesting.
we've been experimenting a lot on delivery of feedback to people who've applied. Because it lands very badly. And, I remember distinctly one candidate who was applying for a software engineering recruiter role, and they came back to me and went, "You've rejected me because I don't have any software engineering recruiting experience, and I've got 20 years of experience." It's like, go back and read your resume because you haven't mentioned it once. And he came back and went, I can't believe I hadn't noticed that I had no detail in my own CV. This kind of how your resume is perceived by the human who read it is a piece of powerful feedback that we're trying to give back, if only at scale to TA folks, because I can give something back to the industry there. But that's a fascinating topic in its own right as well.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think it kind of just, this conversation easily lends itself to understanding how you would teach externals or non-Ashby recruiters. That you have a broad influence, but how do people learn from you? So like, where do you take your learnings from today? Like, where do you learn from today? What resources do you look at? What's interesting to you? I saw the Ashby One and a lot of the different keynotes from the Ashby One conference. You surround yourself with great people, but what are the places that you would send folks to learn a little bit more about some of the concepts that you're talking about? Boolean search, for example, like how would you get someone educated? Because a new grad today coming from agency, I'm not sure is going to know.
There, there's a ton of resources out there. That LinkedIn tends to be the place where I'm consuming information because that's where I'm spending a lot of my time because of the job that I do. So there's huge amounts there. I spend a little time each week researching particular topics. I did a talk last week on talent density and how it applies to Ashby at our company offsite. And so I did my research the week before, and a lot of the things that come up are LinkedIn articles, and it's the comments that I get extra value from and perspective, and spot the individual that I then want to follow and consume that information. So there are numerous different Boolean groups and so on out there, and everything else to do with TA. And you start to see the people that post every day and the value. Luke Eaton, for example, I've known Luke for a long time. I follow him on LinkedIn. He posts every single day. And I mean, there are times when I do a talk and I have to quote Luke 3 times in the talk because it's 3 different things that I've introduced into my way of thinking that he's brought to my attention. For example, so Parkinson's law of productivity when deploying AI technology. I mean, that's a 50-year-old theory, but it applies incredibly well today as just one example. I do have a resume tip for you.
I
Laszlo,
like it.
former head of people at Google, he was there a decade, wrote a formula for how to write a bullet point in a resume, and I stand by its power. Achieved X as measured by Y by doing Z. What did you achieve? How did you measure it? And what did you do? You used to be able to get a job with your resume saying what you've historically done. Then you needed what you've done and how you did it. Now you need what you've done, how you did it, and what the impact was. And my additive point to that is don't just put a percentage on there, because 10% of a dollar is 10 cents. Right? 10% of 10 million is a million. You've got to put the magnitude of the result as well as just the percentage. But if
And
you
don't get cute with the percentages. The number one thing I see, like 67.5%. And you ask someone like, well, what was the number? And they can't give you the underlying math. That kills me.
And a
Anyway.
lot of people will come back on that and say, but I don't have access to the data. It doesn't need to be completely accurate. You've got to be able to talk to the topic and represent that when asked in the interview. The tilde sign is available for you. If you're saying tilde 66%, that's fine.
Right.
Don't hung up on, I can't put it in because it's not completely accurate and no one signed it off.
Yeah, there's no database of your metrics that a recruiter goes and validates. So
Exactly.
with the exception of references and back channels or whatever, we're assuming, right, the framework for our conversation with you about your skills and how we measure the validity of those claims is by referencing the information on your resume and then applying our knowledge of how that works in real life to then assess the size, the scope, the level of influence, the rate of success, et cetera, et cetera. We have an article, How to Write a Resume on Unicorn. I'm going to update it with that, the Jim Millerism.
No. Laszlo Bock gets the credit.
Okay, yeah, all right, with the appropriate, but by way of Jim. Well, great. I mean, follow Jim on LinkedIn. Follow who Jim follows on LinkedIn. Check out Ashby. It sounds like you have a lot of great features that have just released. I saw Note Taker. I saw the fraud. I continually follow the updates by following Ashby on LinkedIn and the newsletter. If you're in RecOps, they have a great Slack community. But just a lot of great information coming out of the space. I think the ATS space was due up for a little bit of a shakeup, and you guys are bringing exactly what the market is looking for. So the feedback's positive. Your growth is an indicator of doing so. And I wish you guys the best of luck as you continue to scale. And I would say parting thoughts with Jim Miller for anyone who's made it to the end of this, 40, 50-minute podcast. What do you want people to know either about you or about something that you're doing today that they can go take away from this podcast?
We are obviously disrupting the TA technology space, but we're also trying to be thought leaders to challenge and disrupt and to come up with new ways of thinking. We talked a lot about giving feedback today, constantly trying to push the boundaries on transparency through the written word. So if you go to our blogs, our job descriptions, you'll be like, wow, I've never seen a company be this transparent. I'm actually doing a podcast in the next couple of weeks with Adam Horn from OpenOrg, all about transparency in an organization and wearing my other hat, my head of people hat, how it impacts your company by being as transparent as you possibly can be. That's the real focus there, and driving that through and the disruption that that's causing. And I welcome the debate and the conversation around these topics as well. When one of our recruiter feedback emails went viral last year, we ended up with 2,000 comments, and I'm up all night live responding because people believe it's AI. And I'm like, no, don't even have a ChatGPT login. This was just me responding based on reading the best part of 500 resumes. Here's my condensed feedback. And thank you to the person who posted that. That was a very late night. But fun fact, off the back of that posting, they became an Ashby customer.
Oh, that's amazing. I love that. Well, look, I think, like I said at the beginning, the secret to my success has been standing next to somebody who is where you want to be. And Jim Miller's a person that I would stand next to for anyone listening. But great to have you on the podcast. Great to hear kind of, some inside info, some deep thoughts with Jim Miller that you might not have covered in other places. And it was just great to get to know you on this level and give our community kind of insights into, how you got to where you are now and what's in it for the future. So thank you for joining the Unicorn Talent Podcast. And I'll be following the OpenOrg. I'll be following Luke and others to kind of see how things progress in the future.
Thank you very much.